11 years after the war that had cut a generation in half, the border between the Vane and Corran territories still smelled faintly of scorched pine, even in the years when nothing burned at all. Some scents, the old wolves said, simply never left a place. They soaked into the roots and waited. Ashgrave Academy sat directly on that line, a fortress of black stone and gray slate raised on the ashes of a keep that neither pack had wanted the other to hold, and so, in the peculiar logic of packs who had bled each other white, both had agreed to let neither of them have it. A neutral school. A cage dressed up as an education. Every noble family sent its heirs here at 18, ostensibly to be trained. History, diplomacy, combat, the old laws. In truth, they sent them here to be watched, weighed, and matched. Because in this world, wolves did not wake up mated the way their grandparents' grandparents had. There was no instant, unbreakable knowing. A wolf might live an entire life beside someone and never feel a thing. The old stories, the ones grandmothers told younger pups by the fire, still spoke of resonance as though it arrived all at once. A single overwhelming certainty that struck two strangers across a crowded room and left neither of them the same again. Ashgrave's instructors taught a version considerably less romantic and considerably more bureaucratic. That resonance, in the modern era, was a slow chemical negotiation between two wolves' scent signatures, built across months or years of proximity, and that it settled, when it settled at all, only once both parties reached the age of 21. It could not be rushed. It could not, by any means anyone had ever proven, be summoned before its time. What it could be, if a wolf were patient and skilled enough, was counterfeited, not perfectly and not for long, but long enough to matter in a school built entirely around the business of matching heirs to advantage. A girl with the discipline to mask her own scent beneath borrowed perfume, to hold her pulse and her breathing in careful check during every calculated encounter, could manufacture the appearance of budding resonance where none existed at all, at least until true chemistry either confirmed or contradicted the performance years later. It was this single vulnerability, more than any other, that had turned courtship at Ashgrave into a 4-year campaign rather than a courtship at all, because no ruling house any longer trusted a match unless it had been tested, watched, and verified from every possible angle first. What a wolf felt, if they were fortunate and unfortunate enough at once, was resonance, a slow-built harmony that only ever settled between two people once they had spent months, sometimes years, in each other's orbit, worn thin by proximity and feeling until something in their blood simply agreed to stay. It came when it came at 21. Never younger. And because it depended so entirely on nearness and emotion rather than any instant magic, it could be counterfeited. A skilled enough wolf could mask their own scent, could season it with borrowed perfumes and practice stillness, could make a room believe an attraction existed where there was only ambition. Which was exactly why the ruling houses no longer trusted romance to sort out their heirs. Courtship at Ashgrave was not courtship. It was a campaign season, 4 years long, run under chandeliers instead of open sky, and the prize for the girl who resonated with the right heir was not a wedding. It was real, working political power, trade concessions, garrison postings, a hand on the treaty that had kept the border quiet for over a decade. Ren Solis arrived on the first morning of autumn term with a scholarship letter in one coat pocket and, in the other, a folder of hand-copied notes on pre-war resonance theory that she had been building since she was 14 years old. She had never wanted to come here. She had wanted, quite badly, to never come here at all. "You're from the 9th Hollow," said the registrar, a tired woman with ink-stained cuffs, flipping through Ren's transfer papers without much interest. "Neutral territory. No house affiliation." "That's right. And you're The woman paused, glancing up properly for the first time, a silent born. Ren had heard the word said in every possible tone over the last 5 years. With pity, with suspicion, with the particular disgust reserved for things people didn't understand and had decided not to try to. The registrar's tone landed somewhere closer to simple bureaucratic caution, as if Ren were a fact to be filed correctly rather than a person. "Yes. Then you'll want to know the rule before you meet anyone in this school. Nobody here can read you. Not your intentions, not your loyalties, not your interest, or the lack of it. Do you understand what that means in a place like this?" Ren understood better than the registrar likely did. It meant she would be the one thing every calculating family in the building could not verify. It meant that whatever she said would have to be taken entirely on faith, in an institution built specifically because no one here trusted anything they couldn't smell. It means no one will believe a word I say, Wren said. The registrar almost smiled. Welcome to Ashgrave. She had earned her place here on the strength of a single thesis proposal, a study of resonance bonds recorded in the decades before the war, when the phenomenon had apparently behaved differently, faster, stranger, less tethered to scent than the modern textbooks insisted it must be. The Academy's oldest scholar of the subject, a war-era relic named Instructor Calder Ash, had personally requested her transfer. It was, everyone told her, an enormous honor. Wren mostly wanted to finish her research, collect her stipend, and go home to the Hollow, where nobody looked twice at a girl no wolf could read. She had grown up in the Ninth Hollow, a scatter of neutral farms and mill towns that owed allegiance to neither Vane nor Corin, where a silent-born child was simply the miller's daughter who couldn't be smelled for a lie, and where, for the most part, people had learned to stop caring after the first few years. Her mother had died when Wren was 9. Her father, a quiet man who mended looms for a living, had never once treated his daughter's condition as anything worse than an inconvenience at market day, when buyers occasionally grew nervous over a girl whose honesty they couldn't verify with their own noses. It was a small life, an ordinary one, and Wren had been perfectly content inside it until Instructor Calder Ash's letter arrived, full of praise for a footnote she'd copied out of curiosity one rainy autumn, and appended the entire shape of her future in a single afternoon. She had almost said no. She remembered standing in the mill with the letter in her hands, her father reading over her shoulder, and saying aloud that she didn't want to go somewhere everyone would look at her the way strangers at market sometimes did, like a puzzle to be solved rather than a person to be known. Go and find out if the puzzle's worth solving on your own terms for once, her father had said. Better that than spend your whole life letting other people decide what you are. She had packed one trunk, mostly books, and arrived at Ashgrave 3 weeks later with no expectations beyond finishing her research and going home again unchanged. The Academy itself, when she first saw it rising black and gray out of the autumn fog, unsettled something in her she hadn't examined too closely. An old, half-buried awareness that this was a place built entirely around the business of being seen, weighed, and wanted, 3 things she had spent her whole life being spared. She noticed him for the first time on the second evening in the library's East Reading Room, and only because half the room noticed him at the same moment, the way a held breath moves through a crowd before anyone admits to holding it. Callum Ashworth Vane did not walk into rooms, so much as rooms rearranged themselves around the fact of him. He was tall in that particular way that made doorways look slightly too short, dark-haired, sharp-jawed, with the kind of watchful stillness that came less from confidence than from 3 years of being watched back by people counting on him to slip. He crossed to a table by the window, sat, and opened a heavy book on border law, and within 4 minutes there were, by Wren's count, 6 young women who had each discovered an urgent need to study in that precise section of the room. She watched this with the detached interest of a woman observing an unfamiliar species of bird, then went back to her notes, because the 80-year-old case study she was cross-referencing was actually interesting, which was more than she could say for the mating theater unfolding 6 tables over. She did not notice him watching her back. She would not have believed it if someone had told her. Chapter 2. The Vane heir had grown very good, over 3 years, at looking like he was listening. It was a specific and exhausting skill. The slight tilt of the head, the attentive stillness, the small nod at appropriate intervals, all performed while some other, quieter part of him tallied troop postings or calculated how many more months until his father stopped introducing him to visiting lords' daughters like a prize bull at auction. He had buried a brother in a border skirmish at 15. He had bled for this territory since he was old enough to hold a blade properly, and for 3 years running, he had been paraded through this library, this dining hall, this ballroom, so that the daughters of council members, generals, and merchant lords could test whether their scent might one day tangle successfully with his. He was tired down to the bone of being wanted for what he might someday sign. Seraphine Doss, daughter of the Vane Surisues own Beta, had been raised from the cradle on the assumption that she would be the one. She managed her performance of interest in Callum with the precision of a diplomat, graceful in front of an audience, colder the instant one wasn't watching, and she had made it plain, quietly, through others, never in words that could be traced back to her, that she considered Ren Solis's very presence at Ashgrave an insult to the natural order of things. A girl no one could smell for honesty, allowed to sit in the same halls as the future of two territories? It offended something in Seraphine that she rarely examined too closely. The Voss twins, daughters of a border lord who held the eastern passes, ran their own competing campaign with rather less subtlety and rather more enjoyment, needling each other over who'd secured the better seat at dinner, who'd been granted the longer conversation, treating the entire four-year contest as a game they intended to win outright and then gloat about for the rest of their lives. Their rivalry with each other had, by second year, curdled into something almost more real than either of their pursuits of Callum himself. And there was Ivy Marin, quieter than the rest, whose family held no great fortune and whose survival at court depended entirely on whether she could maneuver her way into a marriage that kept her relatives fed. She competed for Callum not because she wanted him, but because the alternative, failing to secure anyone, watching her family's modest holdings get absorbed by a hungrier house, was worse. She was, as it happened, the only person at Ashgrave who ever spoke to Ren as though Ren were simply a person and not a puzzle or a threat. The Voss twins, for their part, treated the whole business of courting Callum less like a courtship and more like a running war neither of them could afford to lose. Delphine and Odile Voss had been competing with each other since the cradle, over ponies, over dance partners, over which of them their own father favored on any given week, and Callum Vane had simply become the latest and grandest trophy in a rivalry that had long since stopped needing him as anything but a scoreboard. She sat 2 seats closer to him at dinner. Delphine hissed to her sister, in the corridor outside the dining hall, in a tone that suggested a border skirmish rather than a seating chart. "You let that happen." "I didn't let anything happen," Odile shot back. "He chose where to sit. Unless you're suggesting I ought to have wrestled him into the correct chair myself. I'm suggesting you pay attention. I'm suggesting you lose gracefully for once in your life." It was, in its own absurd way, the healthiest rivalry in the entire school, because neither twin harbored any illusions about what she actually felt for Callum, which was very little, beyond the thrill of the contest itself, and so neither of them ever bothered with real cruelty. They saved that, when it came, for each other, and left Seraphine to practice the sharper arts alone. Seraphine did not consider Ren Solis a rival in any contest that mattered, not at first. A silent-born transfer student with no house, no fortune, and no cent to speak of was, by every rule Seraphine had been raised to respect, no threat whatsoever. It was only in the 4th week, watching Callum's eyes drift twice during a formal dinner toward the far end of the hall where Ren sat quietly with her books, that something cold and unfamiliar took root beneath Seraphine's composure, the first small suspicion that the rules she'd been raised to trust might not, in this one particular case, hold. "You're the one doing the old resonance records," Ivy said, sliding into the seat across from Ren in the dining hall on the 3rd week, uninvited but not unwelcome. "Calder Ash won't shut up about you in seminar. Says you found a discrepancy in the Casio Accord bonding record that nobody's looked at properly in 60 years. "He's exaggerating," Ren said. "I found a footnote. He's the one who decided it was a discrepancy. That's usually how the important things start." Ivy glanced sideways, toward the far table, where Callum sat framed by an entire court of interested daughters, saying almost nothing, eating almost nothing, his eyes moving over the room with the flat patience of a man waiting out a long siege. "You know, you're the only girl in this hall who's never once looked over there." "I have looked over there," Ren said. "Once." He seemed unhappy. Ivy laughed, surprised out of herself. "He always seems unhappy. It's his whole personality. Then it isn't very interesting to look at twice." It was, Ren would later realize, the exact wrong thing to say within earshot of a room full of people whose entire education revolved around reading Scent for Truth, because half the table nearest them went quiet at once, and word of it reached Callum himself before the plates had even been cleared. He did not react visibly. He had gotten too good, over 3 years, at not reacting visibly to anything. But that night, alone in his rooms, staring at a ceiling he had memorized from 1,000 sleepless hours, Callum found himself turning the sentence over with an attention it did not remotely deserve. He seemed unhappy. Then it isn't interesting to look at twice. No one at Ashgrave had ever said something so plainly true about him and meant nothing at all by it. Every word spoken to him here was a maneuver. This one hadn't been. That, more than anything else, was what caught. Chapter 3. Ren's thesis advisor was a man built almost entirely out of old paper. Instructor Calder Ash had survived the war as a young battlefield scribe, one of the last generation to see the old resonance behave the way the pre-war texts described it, faster, less rigidly bound to scent, occasionally settling in months rather than years. He had spent the 4 decades since trying to understand why the phenomenon had apparently slowed and hardened after the war, as though the very bonds between wolves had been reshaped by all that grief. "Your footnote," he told Ren in his cramped, book-crowded office in the Academy's oldest tower, "may be the most interesting thing anyone has handed me in 20 years. It's one line in a 100-year-old ledger," Ren said. "It's one line that says a resonance bond was confirmed between 2 wolves before either of them had reached the scent threshold age. Do you understand what that would mean if it were true and not simply an error of transcription?" Ren did understand, in the abstract, academic way she understood most things about resonance, as a subject to be studied rather than lived. It would mean the bond wasn't only, or even primarily, a matter of scent at all. It would mean something older and stranger was underneath the modern theory, something the post-war generation had either lost or deliberately buried. What Ren did not know, what Calder Ash did not tell her, not out of malice exactly, but out of the particular selfishness of an old scholar who had found, at last, the one research assistant capable of finishing his life's work, was that her usefulness to him went well beyond footnotes. A silent-born could not be scent verified. That fact, which had made Ren an object of suspicion her entire life, made her something else entirely to the handful of aging lords who still believed the peace treaty 11 years old was a humiliation rather than a mercy. To men who remembered the war as something interrupted rather than ended, an unreadable courier was not a curiosity. It was an asset beyond price, a person who could carry anything, promises, coin, battle plans, across the border and through 100 suspicious noses, and never once betray herself, because there was nothing in her scent for anyone to catch. Calder Ash had not built this plan alone. He was an old man who had spent the war grieving and the peace resenting it, and somewhere in the last several years he had begun quietly corresponding with a small circle of old guard lords who considered the treaty a leash rather than a peace, and who had begun, patiently, to lay the groundwork for its unraveling. Ren's transfer to Ashgrave had not been arranged solely because of a clever footnote. It had been arranged because a silent-born research assistant, embedded close to the seat of vain power, was worth more to those men than any spy who could be smelled coming. Ren knew none of this. She only knew that her advisor was kind to her in a way most people were not, that he believed in her work, and that for the first time in years, she felt genuinely useful rather than merely tolerated. It did not occur to her to wonder why an old war scholar with no house affiliation of his own had gone to such trouble to bring one specific, unreadable, friendless girl into the one school in the territory that sat closest to the seat of power. Their working sessions fell into an easy, comfortable rhythm over those first weeks. Calder Ash would produce another crate of yellowed ledgers from some forgotten corner of the tower's archive, and Ren would spend hours cross-referencing names, dates, and the strange old notations that modern resonance theory had long since stopped teaching, because no one currently alive had any use for a version of the bond that no longer seemed to occur. "Here," she said one afternoon, sliding a ledger across his desk, tapping a faded line near the bottom of the page. "Cassio Accord, year of the Second Treaty. A bonding confirmed between the youngest Cassio son and a servant girl from the Eastern household. No title, no scent record listed at all, only a note in the margin that reads verified by pattern, not by nose." Calder Ash went very still, the way he always did when a fragment confirmed something he'd suspected for decades. "Do you know how many times I have searched for that exact phrase in 40 years of research, and never once found it written down so plainly? It could be a clerical error. It could be," he agreed, "but I don't think it is. I think our ancestors understood something about the bond that the post-war generation lost, deliberately or otherwise, and I think you may be the one person alive equipped to prove it." He looked at her over his spectacles, and Ren, still unused to being looked at with anything resembling genuine pride, felt something in her chest loosen at the sight of it. "You have a gift, Miss Solace. Most people spend their whole lives being told their difference is a deficiency. I would like you to consider, at least while you're under my instruction, that it might instead be the sharpest tool in this entire academy. She had thanked him at the time with real gratitude. She would think back on that afternoon many weeks later with a very different feeling entirely. Chapter 4. The first real conversation between Ren Solis and Callum Ashworth Vane happened by accident, in the library, at an hour when neither of them expected to find anyone else awake. Ren had lost track of time cross-referencing pre-war census records against Calder Ash's collection of bonding ledgers, and it was well past midnight when she looked up to find the reading room otherwise empty except for the Vane heir himself, sitting 3 tables away with a stack of border correspondence he was clearly not reading, his jaw set in the particular tightness of a man carrying something he had nowhere to put down. "You're allowed to be here this late?" Ren asked, mostly because the silence had gone on long enough to feel strange, and because unlike every other girl in the building, she had no particular reason to guard her tongue around him. Callum glanced up, faintly startled, as though he had genuinely not registered another person in the room until she spoke. "I'm the Alpha Heir. I'm allowed to be anywhere." "That sounds exhausting." "It is." He said it before he'd decided to say it, and something in his own voice surprised him. The plainness of it, the lack of performance. He studied her for a moment. "You're the Silent-born. The one working with Ash." "Ren." "I know your name," he said, and then, because that had come out oddly intent, added, "Half the school talks about you. The girl no one can read. They talk about you more. They talk about my bloodline. Not the same thing." He closed the correspondence in front of him, a small, unconscious gesture of setting the weight down. "You said I looked unhappy. At dinner. Weeks ago." Ren's face didn't so much as flicker, and it took Callum a moment to remember that of course it wouldn't. There was no scent to catch her off guard by, no flush or spike of embarrassment for him to read. It was, he realized with some surprise, oddly restful. He didn't have to guess at her honesty. He simply had no choice but to take whatever she said as the whole of it. "You did look unhappy," Ren said. "You still do, actually. Most people don't say that to my face. Most people want something from you." "I don't." She closed her own ledger. "I should go. It's late and Instructor Ash expects a full comparison chart by morning." She left without any further ceremony, without the lingering glance or the careful hesitation every other girl in the school had trained into her exit from a room he occupied. Callum sat alone for a long while afterward, turning her sentence over exactly as he had the first one. "I don't want anything from you." He had not heard those words, meant plainly, in 3 years. He began, after that night, finding reasons to be in the places she already was. The rest of the school, meanwhile, continued its usual business entirely unaware that anything had shifted. Formal dinners came and went, each one a small theater of practiced glances and careful positioning. Seraphine perfected a laugh that landed exactly on cue whenever Callum spoke, warm and effortless in front of an audience, gone the instant the room's attention moved elsewhere. The Voss twins traded barbed compliments over the seating arrangements with the grim dedication of career rivals, each convinced the other had bribed a steward for a better chair. Ivy Marin watched all of it with the patient, exhausted calculation of a girl doing arithmetic on her family's survival, and found herself, more and more often, drifting toward the one table in the hall where no one was performing anything at all. "You know," Ivy said to Ren one evening, watching Callum's eyes drift, for the 3rd time that dinner, toward the far end of the hall, "You've become the worst-kept secret in this entire academy, and you don't even seem to have noticed." "I've noticed people talking," Ren said. "I assumed it was about my research." Ivy laughed so hard she nearly choked on her wine. "Ren, no one in this hall has thought about pre-war bonding ledgers in weeks. They've thought about nothing except the fact that the Alpha Heir walks the Eastern Wall every single night with a girl half this school still isn't sure how to categorize." Ren considered this with her usual careful seriousness. "Does it matter what they think it is?" "It matters to Seraphine," Ivy said. "It matters to her a great deal more than she'd ever admit to your face." She glanced sideways, lowering her voice slightly. "For what it's worth, I don't think you should let that frighten you off whatever this actually is. I've watched you both for 2 months now. Whatever's building between you, it isn't performance. I know. I've spent 3 years studying performance the way you study old ledgers. It started small, almost accidental in its shape. He would arrive at the library 10 minutes after she did, always with some genuine piece of work in hand, and take the table nearest hers without comment. He would ask once or twice a week whether she'd found anything new in Ash's ledgers and listen. Actually listen. Not the practiced attentive stillness he performed for council members and hopeful daughters alike, but something closer to real curiosity. While she explained some obscure detail of pre-war bonding law that she assumed, given how carefully everyone else avoided the subject of her research, must bore anyone who wasn't already committed to it. "You're the only person besides Ash who's ever asked me a second question about any of this," she told him near the end of the second week of this new pattern, with something like surprise in her voice. "Most people ask one out of politeness and then change the subject before I can actually answer it properly. I'm not asking out of politeness." Then why? He considered the question longer than it probably warranted. "Because it's the first true thing I've heard discussed in this building in 3 years that has nothing to do with what I can offer anyone." Ren studied him for a moment, the particular stillness of someone weighing a claim she had no scent to verify and had, against long habit, decided to trust anyway. That's a strange thing for the Alpha Heir to find restful. "You'd be amazed what a person finds restful," Callum said, "once you take away everything they're used to performing." Chapter 5. It was not subtle, though Ren, entirely unpracticed in the particular art of being courted, did not notice for some time. The library hours shifted first. Callum began appearing at the same late hour she kept, always with some genuine piece of border correspondence in hand, as though the coincidence were simply the natural consequence of two people who both worked too hard. Then came the patrol rotations. As Alpha Heir, Callum had some limited say over which senior students were paired for the Academy's nightly perimeter checks, an old tradition meant to train heirs in the discipline of the border they would one day hold, and it became, with suspicious regularity, Ren's name beside his on the roster. "You keep ending up where I already am," Ren observed one evening, 3 weeks into this pattern, as they walked the eastern wall in the cold blue dark. "That's either an extraordinary coincidence, or you're doing it on purpose. Would it bother you if I were? I want to know why." Callum considered the honest answer for a long moment, that he liked, more than he had liked almost anything in 3 exhausting years, the fact that she never once performed anything around him, that her indifference to his title felt like the first clean air he'd breathed since his brother died, and gave her a smaller piece of it instead. "You're doing research that might matter to my family's whole understanding of resonance," he said. "I'd like to understand it too." It was not untrue. It was also not close to the whole of it. Ren, who had spent 5 years being told her honesty meant nothing because no one could verify it, found herself, against all her own expectations, inclined to believe him anyway. Not because his scent told her anything, since it never did, but because he had never once asked her for anything the other girls seemed so desperate to offer. "Ask then," she said. "What do you want to know?" So he asked and kept asking, night after night on the cold wall or in the empty library, about bonding ledgers and pre-war census records and the strange, slippery footnote that Calder Ash was so fixated on, and somewhere in the accumulation of those small, honest exchanges, something began to build between them that neither of them had a name for yet, because it did not arrive the way resonance was supposed to arrive. There was no scent signature to notice, no chemical certainty. There was only the steadily accumulating fact of 2 people who had begun, without quite deciding to, arranging their days around each other. One night, walking the frost-hardened path along the eastern wall, Callum stopped mid-sentence and simply looked at her for a long moment, the lantern light catching the sharp line of his jaw. "What?" Ren asked, when the silence had stretched long enough to feel deliberate. "I was trying to remember the last time I told anyone something true without calculating first what it would cost me to say it," he admitted. "I can't. Not before you. That sounds like a lonely way to live." "It is." He kept his eyes on the dark tree line beyond the wall rather than on her, as though the admission were easier to make at a wolf's polite distance. "My brother used to say I'd forget how to want anything for myself, if I kept letting everyone else decide what I should want." I told him he was being dramatic. He was 15 months older than me, and he died before either of us found out which one of us was right. "I'm sorry," Ren said, and meant it plainly, without the practiced condolence she'd have offered a stranger. "I don't tell people that," Callum said. "About him. Most of them already know the shape of the story, and they use it, carefully, kindly, but they use it to explain why I ought to want whatever they're currently offering me. You're the first person I've told simply because I wanted to say it. Ren didn't reach for his hand. She wasn't sure that early that she had the right to. But she stayed beside him at the wall long after the cold should have driven either of them inside, and something in the quiet, unhurried fact of that felt, to both of them, like the truest conversation either had had in years. Seraphine noticed first, because Seraphine noticed everything that threatened her. He walks the wall with the Silent-born, she said to the Voss twins, in a tone of careful, cultivated disbelief, over breakfast in the 4th week. Every night now. Have either of you smelled anything on him afterward? Nothing, said the elder twin. That's what's strange. Usually you can smell interest a mile off. There's nothing to smell because there's nothing real, Seraphine said, with more conviction than she entirely felt. He's using her for the research. That's all it is. She wanted very badly to believe that. She was beginning, in the private hours when no one could see her face, to suspect it wasn't true. Chapter 6. By the 6th week, Callum had begun, without entirely admitting it to himself, forgetting his own last name in Ren's company. It happened first over a shared pot of tea in the library's back alcove an hour before curfew. Both of them bent over one of Calder Ash's older ledgers, a record of paired betrothals from 3 generations back, most of them arranged, a handful of them, according to the strange old notations in the margins, apparently something closer to genuine and early. Vane, she said, glancing up. You've been staring at the same page for 10 minutes. He blinked. He had, in fact, been looking at her hands rather than the page, at the careful, unhurried way she turned each brittle sheet as though it deserved more patience than most things in the world received. Sorry. I was thinking. About the ledger? No. The admission surprised him even as he made it, that plain honesty again, the thing she seemed to draw out of him without ever asking for it. About how strange it is that you're the only person in this entire school who forgets who I am. Ren considered this seriously, the way she considered most things. I haven't forgotten. I simply don't find it very useful information most of the time. You're a person before you're a title. It would be strange to treat the title as though it were the interesting part. Everyone else treats the title as the only interesting part. Then everyone else is missing quite a lot, Ren said, and went back to the ledger, entirely unaware of what she had just done to him. It was around the 7th week that Callum began, quietly, to suspect something was happening in his chest that had nothing to do with scent at all, a warmth that built simply from the fact of her presence, a settling he felt on the nights she was beside him on the wall, and a restlessness he felt on the nights she wasn't. It did not match anything the modern textbooks described. Resonance, by every account he had ever been taught, arrived through scent, built slowly across years, and made itself known through an unmistakable chemical certainty neither party could mistake for anything else. What he felt around Ren was not that. It was something quieter, built entirely out of pattern and behavior rather than any signal his wolf could name, the particular way she pushed her sleeves up when she was thinking hard, the small, unhurried courtesy she extended to everyone regardless of rank, the fact that she had never once, in 7 weeks, asked him for anything at all. He did not know what to call it. He only knew that when they stood together at the far end of the eastern wall, looking out over ground that had swallowed his brother 11 years before the war ended, something in him went quiet in a way it had not gone quiet since he was 14 years old. Ren, for her part, had begun keeping a small, private page at the back of her research notebook that had nothing to do with pre-war bonding ledgers at all, a page of observations about a boy who asked real questions and listened to the real answers, who did not seem to want anything from her except the plain fact of her company, and who, increasingly, occupied more of her thinking than any footnote Calder Ash had ever handed her. She did not call it anything either. She was not yet sure it deserved a name. There was a particular evening, near the end of the 7th week, that she would return to often in memory afterward. A sudden autumn storm had caught them both on the return leg of the wall patrol, and they had taken shelter under the stone overhang of the old watchtower, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him even through her coat, close enough that neither of them tried very hard to pretend the distance between them was accidental. "Everyone keeps telling me this can't be real," Callum said quietly, watching rain sheet down past the overhang's edge. "That whatever settles between us can't be resonance, because there's no scent for it to settle on. My own father all but said as much in his last letter. Maybe it isn't resonance, Ren said. Maybe it's something the old ledgers understood and the modern ones forgot how to name. Does it matter what we call it? She considered this honestly the way she considered most things. I don't think it does. Not to me. He looked at her then. Really looked. The rain-gray light catching the steadiness in her face that never once flickered with the performed uncertainty every other girl in the school seemed to have perfected. Good, he said. Because I've stopped waiting for my own wolf to give me permission to feel this. I don't think it's going to. I think it already decided weeks ago, and it's simply never bothered informing the rest of me through the usual channel. Ren laughed, a small, surprise sound she hadn't quite planned. That's either very romantic or a very serious flaw in your biology. Possibly both, Callum said, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, he looked, standing there in the rain-battered dark, entirely unburdened. Chapter 7. It was Ivy Marin, of all people, who first said the word aloud. You know what this is, don't you? She asked Ren one evening in the dormitory corridor, catching her on the way back from another late patrol with Callum. What's building between the two of you? We're colleagues, Ren said. He's interested in the research. Ivy laughed, not unkindly. Ren. He walks the wall with you every night. He's stopped attending half his own political dinners because they clash with the library hours you keep. Seraphine's had a headache for a month over it. That's not resonance, Ren said, with the flat certainty of someone who had spent 5 years studying the phenomenon academically and understood, better than most, exactly how it was supposed to work. Resonance builds on scent recognition. I have no scent signature for anyone to recognize. Whatever this is, it can't be that. Maybe, Ivy said slowly, it's something the old ledgers you keep reading haven't accounted for. Ren did not sleep well that night. She lay awake turning over the footnote that had brought her here in the first place, a bond confirmed before the scent threshold age, an anomaly the modern textbooks couldn't explain, and found herself, for the first time, wondering if she herself might be standing inside a second such anomaly, rather than merely studying one on paper. She raised it with Calder Ash the next morning, carefully in the abstract, framing it as pure research curiosity rather than the personal question it actually was. Could a bond form through pattern and behavior alone, she asked, without any scent component at all? In a case where one party had no verifiable scent signature to recognize. Calder Ash went very still over his tea, and something moved behind his old eyes that Ren, in her inexperience, mistook for scholarly excitement rather than the calculation it actually was. That, he said slowly, would be the single most significant finding of my career. If it were true, if a Silentborn could form a genuine bond through emotional and behavioral resonance rather than scent, it would mean the entire modern verification system this territory relies on is fundamentally incomplete. It would mean loyalty itself can no longer be reliably smelled. He did not add the rest of the thought aloud, that a girl capable of forming real, undetectable bonds, moving unread through the highest circles of vain power, was worth infinitely more to certain old guard lords than he had even originally promised them. He simply thanked Ren for the question, told her to keep detailed notes on her own observations, and sent her away with the warm, encouraging smile of a mentor proud of his student. That evening, alone in his tower office, Calder Ash wrote a short letter in a careful, deliberately plain hand, and sealed it with wax bearing no house crest at all. It went, by a circuitous route through a merchant caravan that regularly crossed the neutral hollow, to a retired general named Corwin Adair, who had commanded a garrison during the war's final, bloodiest year and had never once, in 11 years of peace, stopped believing that the treaty his own king had signed amounted to a humiliation dressed up as mercy. The girl progresses exactly as hoped, the letter read, unread by any nose in the territory, and now closer to the vain air than either of us dared plan for. Patience a little longer, and we will have found ourselves a courier no border patrol in either territory could ever catch lying. General Adair read the letter twice by candlelight, then fed it to the fire, satisfied. He had spent 11 years gathering old officers who shared his conviction, hoarding grievances and quiet coin, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, not to restart the war outright, which even he understood the territory no longer had appetite for, but to force a renegotiation of the treaty's harsher terms. using whatever leverage could be smuggled across a border too well patrolled for any ordinary spy to manage. A girl no wolf could read was worth more to that project than an entire company of soldiers. Wren, 3 days' ride away, bent over her ledgers with Calder Ash's warm praise still fresh in her ears, had no notion any of this existed. She only knew that for the first time in her life, someone with real standing in the world had looked at the thing that made her different and called it a gift rather than a flaw, and she did not yet understand how completely that single kindness had been built to be used against her. Wren left his office feeling, for the first time in weeks, genuinely hopeful that her strange, unwanted difference might, after everything, be the very thing that let her form something real. She had no way of knowing that the same conversation had just confirmed, for a very different set of interested parties, that she was exactly the tool they had been waiting for. Chapter 8. Seraphine Doss did not waste time on hope. She had been raised to act. The whispers began carefully, in rooms Seraphine was careful never to be seen entering, that the Silent-born's unreadable nature wasn't merely an oddity of birth, but proof of something worth fearing, that no wolf whose loyalty could never be verified should be permitted anywhere near the vain Heir, let alone allowed to walk the border wall with him under cover of night, that Wren Solis's presence at Ashgrave, so conveniently arranged, so conveniently timed, deserved a closer look than anyone had yet given it. It was, in its own way, a clever campaign, because it did not require Seraphine to say a single untrue thing. Wren genuinely could not be scent verified. She genuinely had arrived under unusual circumstances. At the personal request of a scholar with old guard sympathies, no one had ever bothered to examine too closely. Seraphine simply gathered the true, unremarkable facts of Wren's existence and arranged them into the shape of a threat. She confronted Wren directly only once, in a quiet corridor off the dining hall, where she could be reasonably certain no one else was listening. "I don't dislike you personally," Seraphine said, with the composed, unhurried voice of someone who had rehearsed the sentence in advance. "I want you to understand that before anything else happens. This isn't cruelty. It's caution on behalf of two territories that have bled each other white once already and can't afford to do it again over a girl no one can verify." "I understand caution," Wren said. "I've lived my whole life around it. But caution and cruelty aren't always as easy to tell apart as you'd like to believe. You think I'm being cruel. I think you're frightened," Wren said evenly, without any particular malice in it. "Not of me. Of what it means if he actually chose someone the old rules never accounted for, after you spent your whole life being raised to believe you were the only acceptable outcome." Something flickered across Seraphine's carefully composed face, not quite anger, closer to the raw, unguarded surprise of being seen clearly by the one person in the school whose own honesty could never be doubted or dismissed. She recovered quickly. "Believe what you like about my reasons," Seraphine said. "It changes nothing about the facts I've laid in front of the council. You cannot be verified. That is not an insult. It is simply true, and true things in a place like this are the only weapon anyone actually needs." She left before Wren could answer, and Wren stood alone in the corridor for a long while afterward, turning the exchange over, unable to entirely dismiss the small, uncomfortable truth buried inside Seraphine's argument, that however unfairly it had been aimed at her, it was not, strictly speaking, wrong. By the 9th week, the whispers had become something with a name and a schedule, a formal council inquiry into the presence and influence of an unverifiable transfer student within the Academy's inner circles, to be heard before the same body of lords and generals who would, in 3 years, decide which girl became the next Luna. "You have to understand what this looks like from outside," Callum's own father wrote to him, in a letter that arrived the same week the inquiry was announced. "A Silent-born forming an attachment to the Heir, unable to be verified, at a moment when certain old factions in this territory have never fully accepted the peace. I am not accusing the girl of anything. I am telling you that appearances in a house like ours are very often the whole of the war." Callum read the letter twice, then found Wren in the library at their usual hour and told her plainly what was coming, because he had learned, over 9 weeks, that plain honesty was the only currency that had ever actually worked between them. "They think I'm dangerous," Wren said, very quietly once he'd finished. "Because no one can smell what I am. They think you might be being used," Callum said. "By someone. For something. I don't believe it." But the council will want to hear it from you directly, and I want you to know before you walk in there that whatever they ask, whatever they imply, I am not going to sit there and stay diplomatically silent about it. Ren studied him for a long moment, searching, out of 5 years of hard habit, for some reason to doubt him, some angle she was missing. She found none. Why would you risk anything for me? I have no scent signature you can trust. By every rule you were raised on, you have no way of actually knowing I'm not exactly what Seraphine says I am. I know you the way anyone actually gets to know a person, Callum said. Not through their scent. Through everything they do every day when they think no one's keeping score. He held her gaze. I've been keeping score for 9 weeks, Ren. You've never once asked me for anything. That's not nothing. That's the whole of it as far as I'm concerned. It was, though neither of them yet had the vocabulary to name it, the exact moment their bond, built entirely out of pattern and behavior rather than any chemical certainty, quietly, irreversibly set. His father's envoy arrived the following afternoon, a stern, gray-bearded man named Thorn, who had served the Vane household since before Callum was born, and who delivered his king's concerns with none of the softness the letter had carried on paper. Your father asks me to remind you, Thorn said, standing stiffly in the doorway of Callum's rooms, that the heir's residence is not merely a private matter. It is a matter of state. If you attach yourself publicly to a girl who cannot be verified, and it later proves to be a manipulation of some kind, the damage to the succession's legitimacy will not be undone by any apology. I'm aware of the risk, Callum said. Are you aware, Thorn pressed, that there are already whispers among the old garrison officers that the timing of her arrival, so close to certain anniversaries this territory would rather forget, is no coincidence at all? Callum went very still. What anniversaries? 11 years since the armistice was signed, Thorn said. There are men who never forgave your father for signing it. Men who have spent a decade waiting for a crack in this territory's defenses wide enough to argue the treaty ought to be renegotiated on harsher terms. A silent-born girl, unreadable by any nose in either territory, moving freely through the highest circles of vain power, you must see how that could be exactly the kind of crack such men have been waiting for. You're suggesting Ren is part of some plot against my own house. I'm suggesting, Thorn said carefully, that you consider the possibility without first deciding, out of feeling that it's impossible. That is all your father asks of you. Callum did not sleep that night either. He turned the warning over from every angle he could manage and found, in the end, that it did not shake what 9 weeks of plain, unguarded honesty had built between himself and Ren. But it did plant a small, uneasy seed of vigilance that would, within the month, prove to have been exactly the right instinct aimed, as it happened, at entirely the wrong person. Chapter 9. The council chamber at Ashgrave was an old room, older than the academy itself, built from stone salvaged out of the original war-scarred keep, and it held the cold, unhurried authority of a place that had decided things for centuries and did not expect to be questioned while doing so. Ren stood before the assembled lords, generals, and elder statesmen of both territories with her hands folded and her spine straight, aware that every unreadable inch of her was, in this room, itself a kind of evidence. You cannot be scent verified, said the presiding lord, an old ally of Seraphine's own house, not unkindly but not gently either. Which means this council has no reliable means of determining whether your closeness to the Alpha heir represents a genuine attachment, or something else entirely. I understand that, Ren said. I've understood it my whole life. I can't offer you my scent as proof of anything, because I don't have one to offer. All I have is my conduct and my word, and whatever anyone here is willing to make of them. Word and conduct are precisely what this territory can no longer afford to rely on alone, Seraphine said, rising from her seat with the composed grace she had practiced her entire life. With respect to the council, I would remind everyone present that a silent-born makes an ideal instrument for exactly the kind of deception our verification systems exist to prevent. I do not say this out of any personal feeling. I say it because someone in this room must. It was, Ren thought distantly, a very good performance. She could not fault the argument's construction, only the intention buried underneath it. What happened next, the council would discuss for years afterward. Callum Ashworth Vane rose from his own seat, not the composed, diplomatic rising his 3 years of training had drilled into him, but something raw, something closer to the boy who had lost his brother at 15 and had spent every year since being told exactly how a future Alpha King was permitted to feel. With respect to this council, he said, I would like to state something on the record, fully aware of the political risk in doing so. He did not look at his father's letter sitting folded in his own pocket. He looked at Ren. I believe a resonance bond has formed between myself and Ren Solis. Not through scent. I have none of the chemical certainty the law requires as proof, and I will not pretend otherwise. What I have is 9 weeks of behavior I cannot explain any other way. I am not asking this council to simply take my word for it. I am telling you plainly that if the law requires proof this bond cannot yet provide, then the law, as currently written, may not be capable of recognizing everything that a bond actually is. The chamber went utterly silent. Declaring an unverified resonance before the full council, before it could be sent confirmed at 21, was a political risk with no modern precedent. If it later proved false, it could call the entire succession line's legitimacy into question. Callum knew this. He said it anyway. It was, Ren understood even as her chest went tight and strange with something she had no ledger entry for, the single most reckless and honest thing she had ever seen a person do. Chapter 10. The declaration did not end the whispers. It sharpened them into something with teeth. The old guard faction that Calder Ash had spent years quietly courting had been content, until now to wait, to let Ren's usefulness ripen slowly, unremarked. Callum's public declaration changed the arithmetic entirely. A silent-born whose closeness to the vain heir was now a matter of open political record was no longer a useful shadow. She was suddenly, uncomfortably visible, and visible in a way that made every discreet use they had planned for her considerably more dangerous to attempt. Which meant, in the cold calculation of men who had been patient for 11 years and did not intend to lose their moment now, that whatever use they intended to make of her needed to happen quickly, before the council's scrutiny closed every door. Calder Ash came to Ren's small research office 2 nights after the declaration, his old face arranged into an expression of careful, fatherly concern. I've heard what happened before the council, he said. You must be frightened. I'm managing, Ren said, though the truth was closer to overwhelmed, by the declaration, by the scrutiny, by the strange new tenderness that had opened in her chest and had nowhere yet to safely live. There are people, Calder Ash said slowly, watching her with an old scholar's patience, who would very much like to see this treaty renegotiated on fairer terms than the ones your Alpha King's grandfather forced upon them. People who believe the peace, as it currently stands, is closer to a surrender. I do not say this to trouble you. I say it because I think you should understand the world you have wandered into more fully than you currently do. Ren went very still. Why are you telling me this? Because I think, in your position, closer now than ever to the heart of vain power, you might one day be asked to carry something for people who believe in a fairer peace. A letter. A record. Something too sensitive to risk with a wolf whose scent could betray it under questioning. He said it gently, almost kindly, as though offering her an opportunity rather than a trap. You would be uniquely suited to such a task, Ren. Uniquely safe. And there it was, the whole shape of it, finally visible. Ren sat with the old man's words settling over her like cold water, understanding at last why an obscure scholar with no house of his own had gone to such trouble to bring one specific, unreadable, friendless girl into the one school in the territory closest to the seat of power. Her scholarship, her transfer, her entire welcome at Ashgrave. All of it, apparently, had been laid a long way in advance of any footnote in any ledger. You were never interested in my research, she said quietly. I was very interested in your research, Calder Ash said, and had the grace, at least, to look faintly sorry about it. I simply found it useful that it came bundled with everything else you are. You brought me here on purpose. Before you'd ever read a word of it. I brought you here, Calder Ash said, because I am an old man who watched an entire generation of good soldiers bleed into this border, and who has spent 11 years watching a treaty he considers a humiliation get quietly enforced by men too young to remember what it actually cost. I do not regret the war's ending, Miss Solis, whatever you may think of me. I regret how it ended, and for whom, and I have spent a long time looking for some way to correct that without lighting the whole territory on fire again. He folded his hands, unhurried, entirely at peace with what he had done. You were never a victim in my plans. You are the single most valuable asset a cause like mine could hope to find, and I intend to make use of you exactly as thoroughly as I always planned to, whether you agree to it willingly or not. And if I refuse? Then a girl with no house, no fortune, and no one of any real standing to speak for her simply vanishes from an academy. The council will be very reluctant to search too closely, given how recently your presence here was already the subject of an inquiry, he said, without raising his voice at all, which made the threat land harder than shouting would have. I would rather you agreed. I am fond of you in my way, but I will not let sentiment cost me 11 years of patient work. Ren sat with the full, cold shape of it settling over her, understanding at last that the man across the desk from her had never once, in all their long working hours together, seen her as anything but a very well-disguised weapon. Chapter 11. Ren did not sleep at all that night. By morning, she had made her decision, and it was not the decision Calder Ash had hoped for. She went first to Callum, because there was no version of this she was willing to survive alone, and because 9 weeks of plain honesty between them had taught her that whatever came next, it needed to be built on the same foundation, or it would be worth nothing at all. They've been planning to use me, she told him in the cold gray hour before the rest of the school woke, since before I ever arrived. Ash wants me to carry something across the border for men who think the treaty is a surrender rather than a peace. I don't know exactly what yet. But I know enough to know it's real, and I know that if I simply disappear quietly and refuse, they'll only find some other way, and I'll never have proof of any of it. Callum's face in the gray light went through something that looked almost like fear before it settled into the same flat, controlled readiness she had once mistaken, months ago, for coldness. Then we don't let you disappear quietly. I want to let them think I've agreed, Ren said. I want to carry whatever they ask me to carry, exactly once under council watch, so that when they hand it over, there's no question left for anyone to argue with. I don't want to be protected out of this, Callum. I want it finished. It cost him, she could see, everything he had to agree to it, every protective instinct a wolf carried for the one person his bond had settled on screaming against the plan. But he had learned across 9 honest weeks that Ren Solis did not ask for things she had not already thought through completely, and he respected her too much by now to take that choice away from her. They brought Ivy Marin into the plan the following morning, not because either of them fully trusted the wisdom of widening the circle, but because Ivy had spent 3 years learning how the council's procedures actually worked, in a way that neither an academic nor an heir raised mostly on theory could match. If you're going to walk into a council session carrying evidence against a sitting instructor and an unnamed faction of old officers, you need it entered properly, Ivy told them, pacing the length of Ren's small office with the brisk efficiency of a woman solving a problem she found, if she was honest, rather thrilling after 3 years of pretending to care about seating charts. Not handed over quietly beforehand. Laid on the table in front of every lord in the room, at the exact moment they're already primed to be watching you closely. Let their own suspicion of you become the thing that makes the proof impossible to dismiss. You want me to use the inquiry against me as the stage, Ren said slowly. I want you to use everything they've already built against you as the very reason no one can claim it was staged, Ivy said. They think you're dangerous because you can't be verified. Let that same fact be exactly why no one can accuse you of having faked the discovery. Seraphine, when she learned of the plan 2 days later, because Ivy, in the end, could not keep the shape of it entirely from a rival she had grown, against every intention, to respect somewhat over 3 years of shared misery, arrived at Ren's door with an expression Ren had never once seen on her before, uncertain. I want to help, Seraphine said, before Ren could ask why she'd come at all. I built a campaign against you out of true facts arranged to look like a threat. If it turns out the actual threat was standing in plain sight the entire time, wearing a scholar's robes, then I would rather be the one who helped catch him than the one who spent a season making his job easier by pointing everyone's suspicion at the wrong girl. It was, Ren thought, as close to an apology as Seraphine Doss was ever likely to offer anyone, and she accepted it exactly as it was given, plainly, without asking for more than it contained. The plan that followed was simple in its shape and agonizing in its execution. Ren would allow Calder Ash to believe she had accepted his offer, would collect whatever material the Old Guard faction wished smuggled across the border, and would carry it directly into a council session already convened to hear the matter, under guard, in front of every lord who had ever doubted her. The material itself came to her 3 nights later, passed hand to hand through a side door of the tower archive by a courier she never saw clearly enough to name. A leather folio, unremarkable to look at, containing letters in General Adair's own hand, ledgers of coin moved through 3 separate merchant houses, and a rough accounting of garrison postings that would matter a great deal to anyone planning to test the border's defenses. Wren read every page twice by candlelight, memorizing what she could, cataloging what she couldn't and understood, holding it, exactly how much damage a single unreadable courier could have done to the piece if she had ever agreed to carry it quietly instead. It went nearly wrong only once, in the final hour, when one of Calder Ash's contacts, growing suspicious of how easily she had agreed, perhaps sensing something in the too careful steadiness of her manner, attempted to intercept her before she ever reached the chamber, to take back what she carried and silence the matter quietly instead. She had left her rooms at dawn, the folio bound tight against her ribs beneath her coat, taking the long route past the old watchtower rather than the direct path to the council chamber, exactly as she and Callum had agreed the night before. It was there, in the narrow stone stairwell where no one else had any reason to be so early, that a broad-shouldered man she did not recognize stepped out of the shadow of the archway and told her, quite calmly, to hand over what she was carrying. "I don't know what you mean," Wren said, her voice steadier than her pulse. "You know precisely what I mean, Miss Solace." The instructor grows nervous. He would like his property returned before it reaches anyone it shouldn't. She did not have a blade, and would not have known what to do with one if she had. What she had was 5 years of surviving in a body no one could read, which meant she had also spent 5 years learning to appear far calmer than she felt, and she used every hour of that practice now, stalling, asking questions, backing half a step at a time toward the stairwell's far door, buying the handful of seconds she needed. It was Callum, breaking every rule of the very council he was about to stand before by arriving armed and unannounced at an hour no heir was meant to be wandering the tower stairs, who reached her first, placing himself bodily between Wren and a man twice his weight in armed conviction, his voice dropping into a register she had never heard from him before, flat, cold. Entirely without the careful diplomacy 3 years of training had drilled into him. "You will step back," Callum said, "or you will explain to the full council in an hour's time exactly why the Alpha Heir found you assaulting a student in a stairwell." The man hesitated only a moment before he fled, disappearing back through the archway and out into the gray morning, and it was Wren herself, moving with the plain, unshowy competence of a woman who had grown up on the neutral border where trusting no one was simply how you survived, who steadied her own breathing, straightened her coat over the folio still bound tight against her ribs, and got the materials safely into the chamber anyway. She laid it on the council table herself, her hands not quite steady but her voice entirely so, and began to speak before anyone in the chamber could interrupt her with another question about her scent. "3 weeks ago, my thesis advisor, Instructor Calder Ash, asked me to carry sensitive material across the border on behalf of a faction that believes this territory's treaty amounts to a surrender rather than a peace," she said. "I did not refuse him outright, because I understood that a quiet refusal would only send him looking for some other unreadable courier, and this council would never see proof of what he intended. So I agreed, and I carried it, and I have brought every page of it here instead, to be entered before this body rather than across any border." She laid out the folio piece by piece. Letters in General Adair's own hand, ledgers tracking coin moved through 3 merchant houses, the rough accounting of garrison postings that would have told an old enemy exactly where this territory's defenses ran thinnest. The chamber, which had spent weeks debating whether a silent-born girl could be trusted at all, went entirely silent as its own lords read, in handwriting none of them could deny, exactly what certain men among their own ranks had spent a decade quietly building toward. "I would ask this council to consider," Wren said, into that silence, "whether the danger you have spent these past weeks so carefully investigating in me was ever the danger at all, or whether it was simply easier to suspect the one person in this room whose honesty you couldn't verify by scent, rather than look for the danger that had been sitting among you, verifiable and trusted the entire time." Calder Ash was arrested within the hour. He said nothing in his own defense, only looked at Wren with an old scholar's weary disappointment, as though her refusal to be used were somehow a betrayal of the very intellect he had once claimed to admire. You had every gift necessary to change how this territory understands loyalty itself, he told her quietly, as the guards led him from the chamber. I only ever wanted you to change it on the right side of history. You wanted me to change it on your side, Ren said. Those were never the same thing, and I think you knew it long before I did. General Adair and the small circle of old officers named in the recovered letters were rounded up over the following fortnight, scattered across both territories, none of them expecting the folio's contents to have reached the council before their courier ever crossed the border. The 11 years of patient, quiet work Calder Ash had described so calmly in his office unraveled in considerably less time than it had taken to build. Chapter 12. Ren's own scholarship, her transfer, the whole strange architecture of her arrival at Ashgrave, was picked over by the council for weeks afterward, and in the end, it was not her scent that cleared her, because she had none to offer. It was something the old texts had never fully accounted for and the modern ones had actively dismissed, a bond, real and settled, built entirely out of pattern and honest behavior across a season of proximity, verified not through chemistry but through the plain, undeniable fact of a shared dream state that the council's own oldest healer confirmed only true resonance could produce. The healer, a soft-spoken woman named Aunt Ellie, who had served 3 generations of the Vane household, examined them separately at the council's request, asking each of them, without either present for the other's account, to describe anything unusual they had noticed in the past several weeks. Dreams, sudden shared certainty, and awareness of the other's state of mind across distance. Callum described it first, alone in a small side chamber, with the particular discomfort of a man unused to discussing anything so unguarded in front of an official record. The wall, he said. The eastern wall in winter, with frost on the stone and the whole valley quiet below it. We're standing together and neither of us says anything, because there's nothing that needs saying. I've had the same dream perhaps 6 times now, always the same details, down to the exact color of the light. Ren, questioned an hour later in the same chamber, described the identical dream down to the color of the light before Aunt Ellie had given her any hint of what Callum had already said, and the healer sat back in her chair with the stunned expression of a woman rewriting, in real time, everything she had believed about the boundaries of her own field. In 40 years of practice, Aunt Ellie told the assembled council, I have verified perhaps a dozen true bonds by scent alone, and never once witnessed anything resembling a shared dream state independent of it. I do not say this lightly. I would stake my own reputation on the claim that what exists between these two is resonance in its oldest and rarest form. The very kind, I now suspect, that Instructor Ash spent his career searching for in old ledgers, without ever once recognizing it standing directly in front of him. It happened in the end, quietly, on an ordinary night 3 weeks after the arrest, when both Ren and Callum reported to the healer, separately and without any coordination between them, the exact same dream. The eastern wall in winter light, the two of them standing together at the place where the ground still remembered the war, saying nothing at all, needing to say nothing at all. There is no scent signature involved in what you're describing, the healer told the assembled council, with the particular gravity of a woman rewriting something she had believed her entire career. And yet it is unmistakably resonance, the oldest and rarest expression of it, the kind recorded only in the years before this war reshaped how our bonds are permitted to form. I would say, with confidence, that this council has just witnessed proof that our entire modern system of scent verification has been blind to an entire category of genuine bond for the whole of my lifetime. It forced a reckoning no one in that chamber had expected to hold. If loyalty and love could exist and even flourish beyond the reach of any wolf's nose, then the whole architecture of Ashgrave's mating contests, built to protect the treaty from exactly the kind of deception scent alone could never catch, had been standing for 11 years on an incomplete foundation. Ren Solis was recognized, formally and without further debate, not as a political bride chosen for advantage, but as the first Silent-born Luna in the recorded history of the Vane line, and her research, expanded, corrected, finally free of the man who had tried to weaponize it, became the foundation of an entirely new understanding of how loyalty in this territory would be tested from then on. Seraphine Doss, to the surprise of nearly everyone who had watched her spend a season building a case against Ren, was the one who proposed, before the full council, That the Academy's verification procedures be formally revised to account for exactly the kind of bond Ren and Callum had proven possible. I built an entire campaign on the assumption that what couldn't be smelled couldn't be trusted, she said, with the same composed voice she had once used to spread doubt through quiet rooms. I would rather spend the rest of my career correcting that assumption than pretending I never held it. She did not become Luna. She became, in time, the Academy's youngest instructor of resonance law, and she and Ren, against every expectation either of them had once held about the other, settled into something that was not quite friendship but was no longer anything like enmity either. The Voss twins declared the entire contest officially over between themselves within the week, immediately finding some new and equally trivial matter to compete over, to the great relief of everyone who had endured a season of their rivalry. Ivy Marin's family holdings were quietly secured, at Callum's own insistence, through a modest trade concession that owed nothing to marriage at all, the first such arrangement the Vane house had ever granted purely in gratitude rather than alliance, and Ivy accepted it with the same plain, undramatic grace she had shown Ren from the very first week. The evening after the council formally closed its inquiry, Ren found herself standing alone in the small tower office that had once belonged to Calder Ash, now stripped of his books and papers, waiting to be assigned to whichever scholar the Academy chose next. She had expected to feel triumphant. What she felt instead, standing in the empty room where she had spent so many hours believing herself mentored rather than used, was a quiet grief she hadn't anticipated, for the version of the last several months she had thought she was living, and for the plain fact that even the kindness she'd been shown here had turned out to have a price attached she never agreed to pay. Callum found her there in the doorway and did not ask what was wrong, because he had learned, across a whole season of honest conversation, that she would tell him in her own time if she wanted to. I keep thinking, Ren said eventually, that I should have known. That 5 years of people treating my honesty as suspicious should have taught me to be more careful about which kindnesses I trusted. Or, Callum said, crossing the small room to stand beside her, you could let this be proof of something else entirely. That the one kindness which turned out to be false doesn't undo the ones that were real. Ash used you. I never have, and I don't intend to start now. How do I know the difference without a nose to tell me? You've known the difference every single day for 9 weeks, Callum said. You knew it before the council ever needed a healer to prove it to them. You're the one person in this entire academy who's never once needed to be told what's true. You simply see it plainly, the way you saw straight through every performance in this building the moment you arrived. He took her hand, careful, unhurried, the way he had learned to be careful with everything that mattered. I'm not asking you to trust me because a dream matched. I'm asking because for 9 weeks you already did, and it was right. Ren looked at their joined hands for a long moment, and then up at him, and something in her chest that had been braced and careful for 5 straight years finally, quietly let go. All right, she said. Then I trust it. Not the ledgers. Not the healer. You. Callum, for his part, finished the story he had begun before the council with the same plainness that had built the whole bond in the first place. I never wanted a wife chosen because her scent matched a column in a ledger, he told her, on the same eastern wall where the dream had first found them both, the ground beneath them finally, after 11 years, holding nothing but ordinary winter grass. I wanted someone who never once in 9 weeks asked me for anything except the truth. You're the only person who ever gave it to me without asking what it was worth first, Ren said. Neither of them called it resonance. Not really, not out loud. It had never needed the word. It had only ever needed the 9 weeks, the honest questions, the wall, the willingness of 2 people to stand still long enough for something real to settle between them. Behind them, far off across the border, the old scorched pine scent of 11 years past still lingered faintly in the roots of the Ashgrave Hills. Some things, the old wolves said, never entirely left a place. But some things, it turned out, could still grow there anyway. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed watching Ren and Callum find their way to each other through 9 honest weeks rather than any single overwhelming instant. Do you think a bond built entirely on pattern and trust, without a single moment of sense certainty, is every bit as real as the traditional kind, or do you think Ashgrave's council was right to be as cautious as they were before believing it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, Check out the rest of my videos for more, and I'll see you in the next one.